A pleasant day to our fellow BS International Studies students or even those of you who are aspiring to take on this course. Right now, our class would try our best to present to you and relate to you the important topics about diplomacy to inspire you and to give you more knowledge about this topic. Now, first, we will discuss about what is diplomacy. Now, diplomacy is a very big topic, but despite its broadness, the complexity of every topics inside the diplomacy, it's what makes it beautiful. Now, did you know that you are practicing diplomacy? Even though that you don't know the definition of it, you are already practicing diplomacy, unaware or unconscious. Now, diplomacy is coined by our dictionary as the art of dealing in an effective and sensitive way. Now, how can we put it in the context of us as a student or as a youth? Now, remember when you are trying to ask for allowance to your parents and you make plans in your mind on how you will trick them or persuade them to give you money? That is a way, that is also considered as diplomacy. Or how you ask for your teacher to give you more, to extend the deadline of your subject or your projects that you are doing. That is diplomacy. Now, diplomacy in an international scale or world scale, it is how diplomats negotiate with other country to further their international relations of the country that they are presenting. Now, this is very important because without diplomacy, other nations would just trespass the security or the rights of other nations because there is no effective way of dealing with one another. And there would be full of injustices and chaos and no peace at all.
My name is Krisha Marie Viado, and I will be discussing the nature and purpose of diplomacy. Diplomacy and foreign policy are frequently confused, but they are not synonymous. Diplomacy is the primary but not the only tool of foreign policy, which is determined by political leaders through diplomats may provide advice. Foreign policy establishes objectives, prescribes strategies, and specifies the broad tactics to be used in achieving them. To achieve its goals, it may use secret agents, subversion war, or other forms of violence. As well as diplomacy. Diplomacy is the principal substitute for the use of force, underhanded means. In statecraft, it is how comprehensive national power is applied to the peaceful adjustment of differences between states. So the purpose of diplomacy is to strengthen the state, nation, or organization. It serves in relation to others by advancing the interest in its charge. It also works to keep the peace. Diplomacy is heavily geared toward negotiation in order to reach agreements and resolve disputes between states. Even in times of peace, diplomacy may include coercive threats of economic or other punitive measures as well as demonstration of military power to impose unilateral solutions to disputes. Diplomacy, on the other hand, typically seeks to foster goodwill toward the state. It represents cultivating relationship with foreign states and peoples that will ensure their cooperation. And that's all for the nature and purpose of diplomacy.
Did you know that diplomacy is already practiced during ancient times? Early societies of prehistoric times had some attributes of states that actually engage in intertribal relations. It is said that this is where international law arose from. These intertribal relations negotiated events such as marriage, trade, and hunting regulations. They also have messengers and envoys that are accredited, sacred, and inviolable. They usually carried some kind of emblem, a message tape for example, that is received with a ceremony. Women, because of their perceived mystery, sacredness, and holiness were the common envoys. Our ancestors believed that women were entrusted with the vital task of regulating peace in primitive culture. Akkadian, A Babylonian language was the first diplomatic language as the international tongue on the Middle East until it was replaced in Aramaic or by Aramaic. A diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE was also found to exist between the Egyptian court and a Hittite king on cuneiform tables in Akkadian. The earliest known practice of diplomacy actually came from the East, the Mediterranean, China, and India. Glyphs of each history from these places will be discussed as well. I am Ina Marie Gabriel, and this is the ancient history of diplomacy.
It's difficult to say how old China is, but it's one of the oldest cultures that still existed in modern world. Legend has claimed that the Xia Kingdom ruled China from the 2100 to 1600 BC, with Yu as the first emperor. However, there is a scant evidence that the dynasty ever existed. The China had league mission and an established system of polite dialogue. Among their many warring states, by 18th century BCE, however, the China became the world's largest, most populous, technologically advanced, and best government society under the Han and successive dynasty.
Now let us move on with the history of diplomacy, how it started and how it developed in India. Arthashastra is the practice of political diplomacy, and it was created in India. It is an ancient Indian Sanskrit that is mainly a treatise on statecraft, economic policy, and military strategy. Through the use of it, the state posited 6 forms of state policy, namely peace, war, non-alignment, alliances, show of force, and double dealing, which was executed by the 3 categories of diplomats that they have made, which are the plenipotentiaries, envoys entrusted with a single mission, and royal messengers. And now, on to the next state.
And now, we are going to talk about the diplomacy in the ancient Greece. Ancient Greece were in a diplomacy originated, that means a paper-folded people. The ancient Greece had the first diplomats that called heralds or juries that are protected by the gods. The heralds are short-time visitors in the city-state. They also have a proxenate or Greek consular agents. The primary responsibility is to try to also gather information. These also have to diplomatic immunity for their official correspondence and personal property. And that's all for the ancient Greece, and now let's proceed for the next report.
Next stop is the ancient Rome. Rome inherited and adopted what the Greeks invented. With the expansion of Rome, it often negotiated with representatives of the occupied territories, to which it granted partial self-government by way of a treaty. Treaties were made with other states under Greek international law. During the Roman Republic, the Senate directed foreign policy, although a department for foreign affairs was established. The emperor was the ultimate decision-maker in foreign affairs. The envoys were greeted with ceremony and magnificence and granted immunity. Sometimes a messenger or nuntius was sent, usually to towns. For larger responsibilities, a legatio or embassy of 10 or 12 legati or ambassadors was organized under the command of the president. Roman law, which stressed the sanctity of contracts, became the basis of treaties. Romans' main contribution to diplomacy was the development and establishment of a law of nations, or international law. It is a set of rules for international relations that covered such matters as the proper methods of declaring war and negotiating peace. And lastly, they were concerned with the religious implications of starting a war.
For
For the next topic, we are going to talk about the history of diplomacy, its origin and development during the Middle Age. The Byzantine Empire produced the first professional diplomats in the Middle Age. These diplomats were issued written instructions to be polite and market Byzantine wares to lower their costs and encourage trade. They used diplomats as licensed spies and employed the information they gathered to devise skillful policies. At the end of the 12th century, after the collapse of Byzantine Empire, the term ambassador derived from the medieval Latin word ambassador, which means to go on a mission, arose from Italy. This term became popular and was used to describe warriors and boys. And that would be all. Thank you for listening. Hope you got some useful information.
Let's start the evolution of diplomacy during 15th and 17th century. Evolution of contemporary diplomacy. 17th century, 15th and 17th century, the beginnings of the contemporary diplomacy are to send a permanent ambassador during the peaceful times. The contemporary diplomacy was started in northern Italy during the 15th century and spread to the rest of the northern and western Europe in the following hundreds years. Why? Consisting of cities as independent states, Venice, Milan, Florence, Naples, the strongest trade ties. Cultural development was higher than in the rest of European states. The threat of war from France, Italians introduced one of the modern methods of diplomacy, the resident permanent ambassador. Some specific characteristics of the 17th century transfer to today's diplomacy. The duties of the ambassadors to get the domestic info and transfer it to the native state through the diplomatic reports. Secrecy, ceremony, a mode of behavior became today's protocol is to demonstrate the definite intentions of the boss. A city, church, state, presidents in diplomatic protocol was and is a priority. For ambassadors in a country, presidents is determined by the order in which they presented their credentials to the most government.
Thank you. For the 17th to 18th century, it is the permanent diplomatic embassies, the development of ministries, department, offices, and etc. of foreign affairs in Europe, which is in France in the 17th state secretary, archives, and regional departments. The development of the foreign ministry and embassies. The first modern foreign ministry was established in 1626 in France by Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu saw diplomacy as a continuous process of negotiation, arguing that a diplomat should have one master and one policy. He created the Ministry of External Affairs to centralize policy and to ensure his control of envoys as he pursued the raison d'etat, which means the national interest. Development of diplomatic theory. First, France, the source of negotiations by Testament politic by Richelieu 1638. The second theory is idea of negotiations as a basis for diplomacy. And last, training of diplomats, practice as a function. It is in 1712 by Political Academy.
The evolution of diplomacy in 19th to 20th century. In 1918 to 20th century, when old diplomacy was blamed for the start of the Great War, there was a particularly high level of condemnation. Analytically, the term old diplomacy has been used to refer to past kinds of diplomacy in a more neutral manner. This usage first appeared in the 19th century, although it has become more common since the mid-20th century.
Old diplomacy. Australia, Russia, Great Britain, France, and Russia admitted equality instead of precedence among themselves afterwards. In the Vienna Congress, October 1814 to June 1815, meetings are planned in private to prevent the wars, revolutions, and so on peacetime. The Central Powers signed an agreement that they was going to live and act in Europe in accord or harmony. European concert, a planned summits, conference, implement international relations to Europe. Holy Alliance as a mechanism of army intervention to prevent revolutions of Congress system. First diplomatic law, Vienna Convention. They have a rank of diplomats. First, they have the ambassador, envoy, minister, agent, and charge d'affaires. And the function of diplomats transfer in diplomatic law. Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and have 53 articles.
So our next topic is New Diplomacy came as an open diplomacy. International organizations implied public participation. League of Nations in 1919 to 1946. The aim of creation was to solve the conflicts by peaceful tools. The main misfortune was to solve conflicts by peacefully if conflicting sides submit a jointly request for resolving a conflict. Efficiency of League of Nations on diplomacy. A precedent of multilateral diplomacy in UN. Openness of diplomacy. International arbitration, tribunal, and mediation are the tools of diplomacy. Frequent conferences, summits became a diplomatic tools to react rapidly on a conflict. Preventive diplomacy and collective security diplomacy, a system of alliances to prevent aggressiveness, intentions of actors. United Nations, New Diplomacy, 1945, establishment based on the ideas of necessity to apply a superpower by the combined forces to keep the peace. New Diplomacy. What kinds of methods were created for today? Mediation is a method to stop a conflict on the different stages. US as a mediator in Israel-Palestine conflict through pressure talks, sanctions. Preventive diplomacy is to find compromise in the period of pre-conflict situation. Collective security diplomacy, a system of alliances to prevent the aggressive intentions of actors. Hitler and Europe, Iran, and world. Peacekeeping operations as the next step in today's diplomacy. Old and new diplomacy, what kind of diplomatic methods did they create? Number 1 is permanent resident or ambassador as a bilateral diplomacy. Negotiations system of congresses. Multilateral diplomacy as a tool to prevent to mediate. Idea about the collective security became the main strategy of contemporary alliances.